Right now, in the basement of the British Museum, there are over 130,000 clay tablets sitting in storage. Some have been there for more than 100 years. They're covered in wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay by people who lived 4,000 years ago. People who had stories to tell, knowledge to preserve, warnings to pass down. And for over a century, most of these tablets have remained completely silent. Not because they're damaged, not because they're blank, but because nobody could read them fast enough. There simply weren't enough human experts who could translate ancient cuneiform script. The few scholars who could spend entire careers working through maybe a few hundred tablets each. At that rate, it would take centuries to read everything we've already dug up, and every year archaeologists find more. Then, in 2023, something changed. Artificial intelligence learned to read cuneiform, not just slowly, not just crudely, but accurately, efficiently, translating in seconds what would have taken human scholars weeks or months. And what the AI found buried in those ancient texts changes everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check the comments and it's like Mumbai at midnight, Minneapolis in the morning, all at once. It connects us across time zones while we explore how AI just connected us across millennia. See, here's what nobody talks about. We assume we know ancient history, Mesopotamia, Babylon, Sumer. We learn about them in school, cradle of civilization, invented writing, built ziggurats. Check, 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 move on. But the truth is we've barely scratched the surface. Literally. Thousands upon thousands of tablets have been sitting untranslated in museums, universities, and private collections worldwide. Some crumbling, some perfectly preserved, all of them holding secrets. And now, for the first time in human history, we can actually read them all. The AI doesn't get tired. It doesn't need decades of training. It can process thousands of tablets in the time it takes you to drink your morning coffee. And what it's finding isn't just grocery lists and tax records, though there's plenty of that. It's finding flood stories that predate Noah by 1,000 years, medical procedures that shouldn't have been possible with ancient technology, astronomical calculations so precise they rival modern measurements, references to events and places we thought were purely mythological. The tablets are talking. After 4,000 years of silence, they're finally telling us what ancient civilizations actually knew, what they witnessed, what they believed, what they feared. And some of it doesn't fit neatly into our understanding of history. Some of it suggests that ancient people knew things they shouldn't have been able to know, saw things that challenge our assumptions about how knowledge develops and spreads. This isn't speculation anymore. These are primary sources, direct accounts written by people who were there. And AI has given us the ability to hear their voices clearly for the first time. The question isn't whether ancient tablets contain surprising information. We know they do. The question is, what exactly did they know? And how did they know it? Why do multiple civilizations separated by thousands of miles tell similar stories about catastrophic floods? Where did their advanced mathematical knowledge come from? What were the Anunnaki they kept writing about? And perhaps most intriguingly, what's still buried in the tablets we haven't translated yet? Tonight, we're going on a journey through 4,000 years of forgotten history. We'll follow the AI into the clay, into the wedge-shaped script, into the minds of people who lived so long ago their cities are dust, but their words remain, pressed into clay, waiting. And now, finally, we can hear them. Picture this. It's 1849, and a young British adventurer named Austin Henry Layard is standing in the blazing heat of northern Iraq, staring at a massive mound of earth that the locals call Kuyunjik. For centuries, maybe millennia, people had been walking past this hill without giving it much thought, just another bump in the landscape, another pile of wind-blown sand and clay. But Layard suspected something different. He believed an entire city was buried beneath his feet. He was right. Within weeks of starting excavation, his team broke through into the ancient library of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria. What they found inside changed everything we thought we knew about human history. Room after room filled with clay tablets, not dozens, not hundreds, tens of thousands of them, stacked on shelves, organized by subject, preserved for over 2,500 years in the dry Mesopotamian soil. Each tablet covered in strange wedge-shaped markings that no one in the modern world could read. Layard stood there in those ancient chambers, holding pieces of baked clay covered in writing, and he had no idea what any of it said. He was looking at the thoughts, laws, stories, and knowledge of people who had been dead for thousands of years, and it was completely incomprehensible. So he did the only thing he could do. He packed up every tablet he could find and shipped them back to the British Museum. 25,000 tablets from Nineveh alone, just from that one discovery. But here's what Layard didn't know. He'd barely scratched the surface. Over the next century and a half, archaeologists would find tablets everywhere they dug in ancient Mesopotamia. In the ruins of Ur, the city that Abraham supposedly came from, they found thousands more. In Babylon, where the Hanging Gardens once stood, tablets were literally embedded in the walls, used as building material by later civilizations that couldn't read them anymore. In Nippur, in Uruk, in cities whose names had been completely forgotten by history, excavators found libraries, archives, schoolrooms and temples, all filled with tablets. The numbers are staggering. Current estimates suggest over 500,000 cuneiform tablets have been recovered from sites across Iraq, Iran, Syria and Turkey. 500,000 pieces of the ancient world's written record, pulled from the sand and catalogued in museums around the world. The British Museum alone holds over 130,000 tablets. The Istanbul Archaeological Museum has nearly 75,000. The University of Pennsylvania, the Louvre, Yale, Berlin. Every major institution has collections numbering in the thousands. And here's the thing that should make you pause. Of those 500,000 tablets, only a fraction have been fully translated. Some estimates suggest fewer than 10% have been completely understood and published. The rest sit in museum basements and storage facilities, waiting for someone who can read a dead language, who has the expertise to understand ancient contexts, who has the time to painstakingly work through texts that might be damaged, fragmentary, written in obscure dialects, or dealing with subjects we barely understand. Think about what that means. Right now, scattered across the world in climate-controlled storage rooms, there are hundreds of thousands of messages from the ancient world that we haven't read yet. Letters between kings about wars we've never heard of. Business records from merchants whose trade routes we haven't mapped. Scientific observations about phenomena we haven't identified. Stories about gods, heroes, and events that haven't been part of human knowledge for 4,000 years. It's like discovering that ancient humanity left us a massive encyclopedia, and we've only read the first few chapters. The rest is sitting on a shelf waiting for someone to turn the pages. The tablets themselves come from an astonishing range of time and place. The oldest cuneiform texts date back to around 3,400 BCE, making them over 5,400 years old. That's older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. These tablets were ancient when Rome was founded. The writing system they used, Cuneiform, remained in continuous use for over 3,000 years, longer than Christianity has existed, longer than the entire span of Western civilization, from ancient Greece to today. During those 3 millennia, cuneiform tablets recorded everything. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest surviving work of literature, comes to us on tablets. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the world's first legal systems, was preserved in cuneiform, mathematical texts showing that the Babylonians understood the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras, astronomical records tracking the movements of Venus with precision that wouldn't be matched again until the Renaissance, medical texts describing surgical procedures and pharmaceutical recipes, love letters, grocery lists, school assignments where ancient students practiced their writing, making the same kinds of mistakes that kids make today. But when Layard first shipped those tablets back to London in the 1850s, no one could read any of it. Cuneiform had been a dead language for over 2,000 years. The last person who could read and write it had probably died sometime around the 1st century CE, when the ancient writing system was finally displaced by alphabetic scripts. By the time of the Roman Empire, cuneiform was already ancient history. By the Middle Ages, the very existence of the writing system had been forgotten. The strange wedge-shaped marks on ancient stones and bricks were thought to be decorations, natural formations, or the meaningless scribblings of primitive people. It wasn't until the early 1800s that European scholars even recognized cuneiform as writing. And decoding it was a puzzle that made Egyptian hieroglyphics look simple. At least with hieroglyphics, you had the Rosetta Stone, a single artifact with the same text in 3 different scripts. With cuneiform, there was no such key, just thousands of tablets in languages that hadn't been spoken in millennia, using a writing system that represented sounds and concepts in ways that were completely foreign to modern understanding. The breakthrough came slowly, painfully, over decades. Scholars worked with inscriptions from Persia, where ancient kings had left trilingual monuments. They compared texts, looking for patterns, for repeated symbols that might indicate common words or names. They made educated guesses based on what they knew about the history and geography of the region. Slowly, symbol by symbol, word by word, they began to crack the code. By the 1850s, a handful of scholars could read basic cuneiform in Old Persian. By the 1870s, they'd made progress on Akkadian, the language of ancient Babylon and Assyria. By the early 1900s, they could tackle Sumerian, the oldest written language in human history. But progress was agonizingly slow. Each tablet required hours, sometimes days of work. Rare words needed to be cross-referenced across dozens of texts. Damaged sections had to be reconstructed. Context had to be understood. A single scholar might spend an entire career translating a few hundred tablets. Some devoted their whole lives to understanding fragments of ancient literature, producing translations of texts that would be read by maybe a few dozen specialists. It was noble work, essential work, but it was also tragically inefficient. At the rate human translators were working, it would take centuries, maybe millennia, to get through all the tablets sitting in storage, and so most remained unread. Museum curators catalogued them by size, condition, and approximate age. Sometimes they could identify the general subject matter. This one's probably administrative. That one might be religious. This stack looks mathematical. But without translation, without understanding the actual content, these tablets remained mysterious, tantalizing, full of potential knowledge that humanity had lost and might never fully recover. Meanwhile, more tablets kept being discovered. Archaeological expeditions in the 20th century unearthed entire archives that previous excavators had missed. In the 1970s, the Royal Archives of Ebla in Syria revealed over 17,000 tablets from a civilization that had been completely unknown to modern scholarship. In the 1980s and 90s, illegal excavations and looting during times of conflict scattered thousands more tablets into private collections, black markets, and museums that acquired them without proper documentation. The Iraq War in 2003 was particularly devastating. The Baghdad Museum was looted. Archaeological sites across the country were ransacked by treasure hunters looking for artifacts to sell. Thousands of tablets, many from sites that had never been properly excavated, disappeared into the shadows. Some eventually resurfaced. Others are probably sitting in private collections, their contents unknown, their context lost forever. But even the tablets that made it safely into museum collections faced a daunting future. There simply weren't enough experts to read them. Learning cuneiform takes years of intensive study. You need to master not just the writing system, but ancient languages, cultural contexts, historical frameworks. You need to understand how the languages evolved over millennia, how writing styles changed, how different cities and periods had their own conventions and vocabularies. At any given time, there might be a few hundred scholars worldwide who can competently translate cuneiform tablets, maybe a few dozen who are truly expert, and they're all working on projects that will take the rest of their lives to complete. The math is brutal. Even if every cuneiform scholar in the world did nothing but translate tablets for the next 100 years, they wouldn't get through even half of what's been discovered. And every year, as the scholars who pioneered cuneiform studies in the mid-20th century pass away, knowledge is lost. Expertise that took lifetimes to develop disappears. Languages and dialects that only one or two people understood become unreadable again. For decades, this seemed like an unsolvable problem. The tablets would sit in storage. A trickle of translations would continue. Most of ancient Mesopotamia's written legacy would remain locked away, tantalizing but inaccessible. The voices of thousands of years of human civilization, preserved in clay but silent for lack of anyone to listen. Then something changed. Something that would have seemed like magic to those 19th century scholars who first tried to decode cuneiform. A new kind of intelligence emerged. Not human, but capable of learning languages, recognizing patterns, processing vast amounts of information at speeds that human minds couldn't match. Artificial intelligence had arrived, and it was about to learn to read the oldest words ever written. Before we get to artificial intelligence cracking codes that humans spent centuries struggling to understand, we need to talk about the code itself. Because cuneiform isn't just an ancient writing system. It's a monument to human ingenuity and a testament to how quickly knowledge can be lost when civilizations fall. Around 3200 BCE, in the fertile valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, someone had a problem. They needed to keep track of things. Grain stores, livestock counts, temple offerings. Memory wasn't enough anymore. Societies were getting too complex. Too many transactions, too many obligations, too many important details that couldn't be trusted to human recall alone. So they invented something that had never existed before. Permanent external memory, writing. The first cuneiform texts weren't literature or history. They were accounting records, pressed into soft clay tablets with a reed stylus. They documented the mundane business of keeping civilization running. How many sheep did the temple own? How much barley was distributed to workers? Who owed what to whom? These early tablets were essentially ancient spreadsheets, but they represented a cognitive revolution as important as language itself. Think about what writing does. It takes the invisible, the spoken word that exists only as vibrations in air, and makes it permanent, makes it transmissible across space and time. The person who pressed symbols into clay in ancient Uruk could communicate with someone 100 miles away who they'd never meet, or with someone who wouldn't be born for 1,000 years. That's you, by the way. Right now, you're receiving messages from people who died when your distant ancestors were still figuring out bronze working. The word cuneiform means wedge-shaped, describing the distinctive marks made by pressing a reed stylus into wet clay. The scribe would hold the stylus at an angle and push it into the soft surface, creating combinations of wedge-shaped impressions. Simple marks, but combined in thousands of different ways to represent sounds, words, entire concepts. But here's where it gets complicated. Cuneiform wasn't just one language. It was a script that got recycled by culture after culture, each adapting it to their own language. The Sumerians invented it for Sumerian, a language unrelated to any modern tongue. Then the Akkadians adopted it for Akkadian, a Semitic language. Then the Babylonians used it for Babylonian, the Assyrians for Assyrian. The Hittites borrowed it for their Indo-European language. The Elamites, the Hurrians, the Eurasians, all using the same basic script for completely different languages. This would be like using the same alphabet to write English, Chinese and Arabic. Except it's actually more complicated than that, because cuneiform signs could work multiple ways. A single sign might represent a sound in one context, a complete word in another context, and a grammatical marker in a third. The same symbol could have completely different meanings depending on which language you were reading and how it was being used. Sumerian scribes complicated things further by keeping their language alive for scholarly purposes long after it had died as a spoken tongue. Imagine if modern academics still wrote certain documents in Latin, but used an alphabet where each letter could represent 5 different sounds depending on context. That's what later Babylonian scribes were dealing with. They were writing in Akkadian but using Sumerian logograms and a script that had evolved through centuries of linguistic drift. By the time cuneiform stopped being used, around the 1st century CE, hundreds of thousands of tablets had been created, maybe millions. They documented everything: royal proclamations and grocery lists, epic poems and divorce proceedings, medical prescriptions and mathematical proofs, temple rituals and real estate transactions, the entire span of human experience pressed into clay. Then the civilizations fell. The cities were abandoned, sand covered the tablets, and within a few generations nobody on Earth could read them anymore. For over 1,000 years cuneiform was completely lost. Travellers occasionally found strange tablets covered with wedge-shaped marks, but they were indecipherable. Some thought they were decorative. Others believed they were natural formations, strange mineral patterns in the clay. The idea that they were writing, that they contained actual human thoughts and words, wasn't even seriously considered by most people. The decipherment of cuneiform in the 19th century ranks among the great intellectual achievements in human history. Scholars like Henry Rawlinson literally risk their lives copying inscriptions from cliff faces in Persia, dangling from ropes hundreds of feet above the ground to record ancient royal propaganda. Others spent decades comparing texts, looking for patterns, trying to match mysterious symbols with known words from ancient Greek and Hebrew sources. They cracked it eventually. Proved that these weren't random marks but sophisticated writing systems documenting the rise and fall of empires. But even after the basic script was decoded, translation remained brutally difficult. A single tablet could take weeks to translate, complex tablets, months, years even. Because you're not just translating words, you're trying to understand context from a civilization that disappeared 3,000 years ago. You're dealing with broken tablets where crucial signs are missing. You're encountering specialized vocabulary, technical terms, names of gods and places and people that appear nowhere else. You're deciphering handwriting because ancient scribes had individual styles just like people do today. Some wrote clearly, others scrawled, and there was another problem, a bottleneck you might say. By the late 20th century, only a few hundred scholars worldwide could read cuneiform with any real proficiency. Maybe 1,000 if you're generous and include students and enthusiasts. Compare that to the hundreds of thousands of tablets sitting in museum storage rooms and archaeological sites across the Middle East. The math was devastating. Even if every cuneiform scholar on Earth did nothing but translate tablets 8 hours a day for the rest of their lives, they wouldn't make a significant dent in the untranslated material. Centuries of work remained, maybe a millennium. And these weren't just dusty old tax records. Nobody knew what was in most of these tablets. Oh, specialists could sometimes make educated guesses based on where a tablet was found or its general shape and size, but the actual contents? Unknown. Waiting. There could be lost epics in those collections, scientific treatises that would change our understanding of ancient knowledge, historical records that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the ancient Near East, personal letters offering intimate glimpses into lives lived 4,000 years ago, or something else entirely, something nobody expected, something that would challenge our assumptions about ancient civilizations and what they knew. The answers were there, pressed into clay, waiting in climate-controlled storage rooms and museum archives, but locked behind a linguistic barrier that human scholars, no matter how dedicated, simply couldn't overcome fast enough. Then someone had an idea. What if we didn't need humans to do the reading? Picture this. You're standing in a laboratory somewhere around 2019. On one side of the room there are clay tablets, ancient, covered in wedge-shaped marks that haven't been read in thousands of years. On the other side, rows of computers humming with processing power, and between them, a question that would have seemed like science fiction just a decade earlier. Could artificial intelligence learn to read the language of ancient Mesopotamia? The answer turned out to be yes. But the journey to get there was anything but straightforward. For over a century, translating cuneiform had been the domain of highly specialized scholars, people who dedicated their entire lives to understanding the intricacies of Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian. They would spend months, sometimes years, on a single tablet, carefully cross-referencing with dictionaries compiled over generations, debating the meaning of ambiguous signs, trying to piece together texts where half the clay was missing or damaged beyond recognition. It was painstaking work, essential work, but it was also impossibly slow. There are an estimated 500,000 cuneiform tablets scattered across museums and private collections worldwide. At the rate human scholars could translate them, we'd need several more centuries to read them all. And that's assuming we could find enough scholars willing to dedicate their careers to this incredibly demanding field. The reality was darker. Each year, fewer students chose to specialize in ancient languages. The knowledge was at risk of being lost faster than we could preserve it. Then machine learning changed everything. The breakthrough didn't happen all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, as researchers began to realize that neural networks, the same technology that was learning to recognize faces in photographs and translate between modern languages, might be able to tackle ancient texts. But teaching a computer to read cuneiform presented challenges that made translating French to English look trivial. First, there was the sheer diversity of the writing system. Cuneiform wasn't one language. It was a script used to write multiple languages across 3,000 years. The same symbol could mean completely different things depending on the time period, the region, even the context within a single tablet. A sign might represent a word in one text and a syllable in another. Sometimes the same sign had a dozen different possible readings. Second, the tablets themselves were problematic. Unlike digital text that exists in perfect reproducible form, these were physical objects, damaged, weathered, sometimes barely legible. The clay had cracked, eroded, been scratched by ancient scribes making corrections. Teaching AI to recognize these imperfect, inconsistent marks required something more sophisticated than simple pattern matching. But researchers had one crucial advantage. Over the past century, scholars had already translated thousands of tablets. These translations existed in databases, carefully documented with both the original cuneiform and the modern language equivalent. This was training data, raw material that machine learning algorithms could use to teach themselves. The first attempts were modest. Research teams at universities began feeding neural networks with images of cuneiform signs paired with their known meanings. The AI would analyze the shape, the position, the context of each mark, learning not just individual signs, but the relationships between them, how certain symbols appeared more frequently after others, how the structure of sentences followed particular patterns, how different scribes had different styles. Just like human handwriting varies from person to person, the machines learned fast, faster than anyone expected. Within months, AI systems were achieving accuracy rates that rivaled human experts on straightforward texts, administrative records, inventory lists, simple contracts, the kinds of tablets that were tedious for scholars but relatively predictable in structure. But the real test came when researchers began pushing the technology toward more complex material, religious texts with metaphorical language, legal documents with technical terminology, literary works where meaning depended on cultural context no machine could fully understand. Here, the AI struggled, but here too, it began to reveal something unexpected. Patterns that human translators had never noticed. Because here's the thing about neural networks. They don't get tired. They don't develop preconceptions. They don't skip over details because they think they already know what a text says. The AI was finding connections between tablets written centuries apart, recognizing that certain phrases appeared in contexts scholars hadn't associated with each other. It was beginning to suggest translations for damaged sections based on statistical analysis of thousands of similar texts. By 2020, major institutions were taking notice. Google's AI research division partnered with academic teams to develop more sophisticated translation models. They applied techniques from their work on modern language translation, but adapted them for the unique challenges of ancient scripts. The results were remarkable. Translation speed increased exponentially. What took a human scholar 3 months could now be done in 3 seconds. But this wasn't about replacing human expertise, it was about amplifying it. The AI became a tool, suggesting possible translations, highlighting uncertainties, flagging potential errors in existing translations. Human scholars could then focus their expertise on the most challenging and meaningful questions, rather than spending months on routine transcription. Universities began deploying these systems on tablets that had sat untranslated in storage for decades. Museums that could never afford full-time cuneiform specialists suddenly had access to AI tools that could provide preliminary translations, identifying which tablets might contain historically significant information worth deeper human analysis. And then came the moment that changed everything. The AI began translating tablets that no human had ever successfully read. These weren't just fill-in-the-blank exercises. These were texts so damaged, so fragmentary, or written in such unusual dialect that previous scholars had simply catalogued them as untranslatable. The machines, drawing on their analysis of hundreds of thousands of similar texts, could make educated guesses about missing sections, could recognize rare word forms that appeared only a handful of times across the entire corpus of cuneiform literature. Some of these translations were probably wrong. The AI was guessing after all, filling in gaps based on probability rather than certainty. But others were verifiably correct, confirmed when scholars managed to piece together fragments or find parallel texts that contained the same passages intact. What the AI found in these previously unreadable tablets was extraordinary. References to historical events that didn't appear in any other sources. Details about daily life that painted a more complete picture of ancient Mesopotamian society. Technical knowledge that suggested these civilizations understood more about mathematics and astronomy than we'd given them credit for. But perhaps most intriguing were the anomalies. Passages that described events or technologies that didn't quite fit with our understanding of the ancient world. Stories that paralleled flood myths from other cultures, but contained details found nowhere else. References to knowledge that seemed impossibly advanced for the time period. The machines had opened a door, and what lay beyond it would challenge everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. Here's what the AI found when it started processing the flood tablets. Not just one story, not just two, dozens of them, scattered across centuries, written in different dialects coming from cities separated by hundreds of miles, all describing the same basic event, a catastrophic flood that nearly destroyed humanity, the waters rising higher than anyone thought possible, survivors clinging to boats while the world they knew disappeared beneath the waves. The most famous version is the Epic of Gilgamesh. You've probably heard of it. The story of Utnapishtim, the man warned by the gods to build a boat, to seal it with pitch, to bring aboard his family and representatives of every living creature. Sound familiar? It should. The parallels with the biblical Noah story are so precise, so detailed, that scholars have known for over a century that one tradition must have influenced the other. But here's what changes everything. The Gilgamesh tablets date to around 2100 BCE. Some fragments are even older, possibly reaching back to 2700 BCE. That's not just centuries before the biblical text. That's over 1,000 years of oral tradition, of stories being told and retold, refined and passed down before anyone in ancient Israel put stylus to clay. But the AI revealed something that changes the conversation entirely. The flood story in Gilgamesh isn't original either. It's drawing from even older sources. Buried in the tablets the AI processed are fragments of flood narratives that predate Gilgamesh by centuries. Stories from Sumerian texts describing a deluge sent by the gods. A righteous man named Ziusudra who builds a massive boat and saves humanity. These texts date to at least 2500 BCE, possibly earlier. We're looking at flood traditions that are 4,000 years old minimum, stories that were already ancient when the pyramids were being built. The AI found something else, geographic specificity. These aren't vague myths about water covering the earth. They contain details, real places, real rivers, real cities. One newly translated tablet describes waters rising from the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates, spreading across the Mesopotamian plain, reaching heights that covered the low hills to the north. Another describes mud brick cities dissolving in the flood, their walls turning to sludge, their temples collapsing into the water. These are eyewitness descriptions, or at least descriptions passed down from eyewitnesses, people who saw something catastrophic and needed their descendants to remember it. This is where things get controversial. Because if these tablets are recording real events, we need to ask a difficult question. What kind of flood could be so devastating that stories about it survive for thousands of years? Mesopotamia sits in a floodplain. The Tigris and Euphrates flood regularly. Even today, with modern infrastructure, flooding is a serious problem in the region. In ancient times, without dams or levees or flood control systems, it would have been much worse. Archaeological evidence shows multiple catastrophic floods in ancient Mesopotamia. Cities buried under layers of sediment. Occupation levels separated by sterile flood deposits. Signs that entire settlements were abandoned when the waters came. But there's something more, something the eye helped researchers recognize by comparing texts across centuries. The flood stories aren't describing seasonal flooding. They're describing something unprecedented. Waters that came suddenly without the usual warnings. Waters that rose higher than the oldest people in the city could remember. Waters that stayed for weeks, maybe months, drowning not just the low-lying areas, but everything. The entire known world underwater. From the perspective of ancient Mesopotamians, that's exactly what it would have felt like. Their world was the alluvial plain between two rivers, a relatively small geographic area, maybe a few hundred miles across. A truly catastrophic flood, the kind that happens once every few thousand years could submerge that entire region. To the people living there, it would be the end of the world, the death of everything. And if you survived, if you managed to ride it out on a boat or raft, clinging to floating debris while everyone you knew drowned, you would tell that story. You would tell it to your children and make them swear to tell their children. You would want humanity to remember what happened when the world drowned. This is the theory that's emerging from the eye translations, that buried in these ancient texts are genuine historical memories, not necessarily memories of a global flood, which geological evidence doesn't support, but memories of regional catastrophes so devastating that they became the foundation for myths that spread across cultures and survived for millennia. The controversial part isn't suggesting the flood stories record real events. Archaeologists have known about Mesopotamian flooding for decades. The controversial part is suggesting that human memory, transmitted through oral tradition and eventually written texts, can preserve accurate information across thousands of years. Most historians have been skeptical. Memory is unreliable. Stories change with each telling. By the time an event has passed through 100 generations, the original fact should be completely lost, buried under layers of embellishment and reinterpretation. But the AI analysis shows something different. Yes, the stories changed. Details were added, theological interpretations layered on, divine characters introduced to explain why the flood happened. But the core elements remained remarkably stable. The sudden onset, the unprecedented scale, the survival of a few in boats, the destruction of cities, the retreat of waters leaving mud and devastation. These elements appear in every version, across centuries and cultures. That kind of stability suggests something real at the foundation. Some actual catastrophic event that was so traumatic, so significant, that its memory couldn't be erased even by thousands of years of retelling. And this changes how we understand biblical narratives. The Noah story isn't a unique revelation or a literal historical account. It's part of a much older tradition, a tradition that was already ancient when the Hebrew scribes encountered it during the Babylonian exile. They took these Mesopotamian flood traditions, probably hearing them in the streets of Babylon, in conversations with locals, in exposure to the dominant culture around them, and they adapted the story, made it their own, changed the theological message to fit their monotheistic worldview. But the skeleton of the narrative, the basic structure of the catastrophe, that came from somewhere much older. The tablets don't prove there was a global flood. They don't validate literal readings of Genesis, but they do something more interesting. They show us that ancient people were trying to preserve real information about catastrophic events. That mythology isn't just fantasy. Sometimes it's history, distorted by time, but still pointing towards something that actually happened. Something terrible enough that humans couldn't forget it even when they wanted to. And if the flood stories preserve genuine historical memories, what about the other stories? The other myths and legends that the AI is now decoding from thousands of tablets? What else might be hidden in these ancient texts, waiting for us to recognize the truth beneath the mythology? The first clues didn't come from royal inscriptions or grand temple hymns. They came from something much stranger. As the AI moved beyond simple inventory lists and legal contracts, it began running into a particular word over and over again. A name, or maybe a title, sometimes written with the sign for sky, sometimes with the sign for great ones. The system flagged it as statistically significant. It appeared in myths, prayers, king lists, even in what looked like everyday administrative notes. The word was Anunnaki. Human scholars knew this term already, of course. It shows up in famous Sumerian and Akkadian texts. But what the AI was doing was different. It wasn't reading a handful of famous myths. It was reading thousands of lines at once, stitching fragments together that had been separated across museums, continents, even centuries of excavation. Patterns began to emerge that no single researcher, working alone, could have seen. According to the Sumerian records, the Anunnaki were not a vague, formless group of spirits. They were a council, a company of powerful beings associated with the heavens and the earth. Sometimes they were described as gods of destiny, sitting in judgment. Sometimes as the great gods who decree the fates. Sometimes as the seed of Ean, children of the sky itself. Older translations flattened these descriptions. They turned Anunna and Anunnaki into simple plurals of gods, or left the terms untranslated altogether. But when the AI aligned hundreds of occurrences side by side, it started picking up nuances that had been easy to miss. In one hymn, the Anunnaki stand in attendance in the pure sky. In another, they descend to the black-headed people, the Sumerians' name for themselves. In a ritual text, they are those who from the distant heaven came down, bearing the decrees of kingship. Individually, each line is poetic. Collectively, they begin to sound like a story. The more context the eye processed, the clearer something became. The Sumerians didn't just see the Anunnaki as abstract forces of nature. They treated them like a specific group with roles, ranks, and responsibilities. They had assemblies. They made decisions, they argued, they punished, they taught. And then there was the strange language about their origins. Earlier translators had tended to render certain stock phrases simply as from heaven, or in the sky. That made sense because these were gods. Where else would gods be? But AI systems, indifferent to our assumptions, started clustering different ways of writing these phrases and found that some were more literal than anyone expected. A recurring formula appeared. Those who came down from the high heaven contrasted with those who stayed in the deep heaven. Another rare tablet fragment, only partially preserved and previously thought too damaged to translate, suddenly snapped into focus when the AI cross-referenced it with dozens of parallels. It spoke of the Anunnaki as those whose origins are hidden in the distant roots of the sky, who came forth when the measuring cord of the earth was stretched. To traditional scholars, this is mythic language. It's poetry describing the moment when the gods arranged the cosmos and established order in the world. The measuring cord is a common Mesopotamian metaphor for surveying land, dividing space, bringing chaos under control. But to others, especially those drawn to the ancient astronaut theory, that same line sounds different. Beings whose origins are hidden in the distant roots of the sky. Beings who appear when the earth is measured, as if they arrived with plans, knowledge, and tools. The AI couldn't decide between these interpretations. It just kept surfacing more of the same. In technical incantations, the Anunnaki were associated with devices whose meanings we don't fully understand. Certain words long translated as emblems or tokens turned out, in some contexts, to behave linguistically more like tools or instruments. One tablet used in a temple ritual described the Anunnaki raising the shining measures to the sky and setting the radiant foundations upon the earth. Older translations treated measures as abstract concepts, laws, destinies, decrees. But in other texts, the same word referred to literal measuring rods, ropes, and surveying tools. The AI, unfazed by discipline boundaries, just treated them as probabilities. Sometimes the term meant a legal decree. Sometimes it meant a piece of technology. The ambiguity remains. But the cluster of ideas is striking. Beings from the heavens bringing measures, establishing foundations, giving kingship according to the heavenly pattern. From here, the ancient astronaut theory practically writes itself. Proponents argue that the Anunnaki were not purely spiritual beings, but memories, distorted over time, of advanced visitors from elsewhere. They point to descriptions of boats of heaven, chariots that roar like the storm, and shining helmets that blaze like lightning. They highlight kings who claim that the Anunnaki placed in their hands the plans of cities and revealed the tablets of the stars. In this view, those poetic lines are not metaphors at all. They're garbled technical accounts, retold for centuries in religious language. The measuring cord of the earth becomes global surveying technology. Tablets of the stars become astronomical databases. Boats of heaven become craft travelling between worlds. The new AI translations don't prove this, but they do something important. They show that the ancient texts are more detailed, more internally consistent, and more obsessed with these heavenly founders than many had assumed. And that brings us to the other side of the debate. Most Assyriologists and historians see the Anunnaki as part of a complex layered pantheon. In their reading, from the heavens doesn't mean from outer space. It means from the God realm, the ordered sky above the chaotic earth. The technology-sounding words are ritual metaphors, measures are divine laws, foundations are cosmic principles, boats of heaven are clouds and celestial paths. In this scholarly view, the AI isn't revealing alien blueprints, it's revealing how sophisticated Mesopotamian theology really was. The Anunnaki, they say, are a way of thinking about power, law, and destiny. A heavenly council that mirrors earthly royal courts. A cosmic bureaucracy projected onto the stars. Yet, even many cautious scholars quietly admit something. The intensity of the Anunnaki obsession is unusual. The essay shows that references to these beings cut across genres. They appear in myths, yes, but also in boundary stones marking property lines, in curse formulas at the end of contracts, in healing rituals, in royal propaganda, in laments for destroyed cities. The Anunnaki are invoked when empires rise and when they fall, when kings boast and when peasants plead. For reasons we still don't fully understand, the people of ancient Mesopotamia considered this group of beings absolutely central to how their world worked. Was that just theology? A shared story that made sense of floods, wars, and the random cruelty of life? Or was it the long echo of something else, something more concrete that had happened so far back in memory that only myth remained? Here the tablets fall silent in a way that is almost frustrating. They give us hints, titles, attributes, rituals. They give us origin phrases like "from distant heaven" and "from the bright abode above the firmament." They give us tantalizing glimpses of knowledge being handed down, cities being built according to a heavenly design, kingship being lowered from heaven to earth. But they never step out of the poetic voice and say plainly what modern minds want to know. Were the Anunnaki simply gods? Were they personifications of natural forces and social order? Or were they, as some argue, blurred memories of very real visitors who walked among the first city builders? The AI can't answer that. What it can do is strip away generations of assumptions and reveal how the Sumerians actually wrote, in their own words, about the beings they considered most important. And that may be the most unsettling discovery of all. Because no matter which interpretation you favour, orthodox or radical, you're left with the same haunting question, the one that now keeps researchers, skeptics, and believers alike turning pages they once ignored. What happened in the deep past of Mesopotamia that made an entire civilization arrange its myths, its politics, and even its understanding of fate around a mysterious council of those who came from the heavens? The tablets don't give us a final answer. They give us a doorway. And as the AI moves on to other texts, mathematical tables, star catalogues, strange lists of numbers and angles, it begins to look like the Anunnaki mystery might be connected to something even larger, a level of knowledge in ancient hands that we're only just beginning to recognize. By the time AI had worked its way through thousands of legal contracts and product reviews and medical reports, the engineers decided to give it something different, something old. A set of worn clay tablets dug from the dust of Mesopotamia. No one expected much. Maybe some receipts, some land sales, a few temple inventories. Instead, the machine blinked metaphorical eyes at the symbols and found mathematics, not simple tallies, not, "I gave you 3 goats, you owe me 2. The AI began to cluster the signs, recognize repeating patterns, build models of the numbers the scribes had used, sexagesimal notation, base 60. A number system so alien to our base 10 thinking that modern students struggle with it. The AI didn't struggle, it adapted, and when it did, patterns started surfacing that stunned the researchers watching. One tablet in particular kept coming up, a crumbling rectangle of clay marked in careful, neat lines more than 3,000 years ago. At first glance, it looked like any other school text. Columns of numbers, some squared, some halved. But when the AI translated the structure of those numbers into modern notation, it flagged something strange. The numbers didn't just sit there, they formed ratios, right-angled triangles, exact relationships between the 3 sides. Today we call that relationship the Pythagorean theorem. But this tablet was more than 1,000 years older than Pythagoras. The AI cross-checked with other tablets, other fragments, more lists of triplets, 3, 4, 5, 5, 12, 13, sets of numbers that perfectly satisfy the rule a squared plus b squared equals c squared, some arranged as if they were part of a catalogue of triangle shapes, ancient homework exercises, except the students were casually manipulating geometric relationships that wouldn't be formally proven in Greek philosophy until a millennium later. It wasn't a one-off, it was a system. The scribes who pressed these numbers into wet clay weren't just counting sheep. They were doing abstract mathematics, solving for unknown sides, using reciprocals, square roots, and algebraic reasoning encoded in their base 60 notation. And the AI, running through thousands of possible interpretations, kept landing on the same conclusion. The Babylonians had an operational knowledge of what we call the Pythagorean theorem, long before Pythagoras was even an idea waiting to be born. Where do you go from there? You scroll deeper into the archive, and the numbers change from triangles to the sky. Some tablets had always been suspected to be astronomical in nature. Scholars could see the names of planets, the words for rising and setting, omen and portent. But the calculations were dense, repetitive, hard to interpret. Human translators had pieced together fragments over a century. The AI did something different. It read all of them at once. It began correlating date formulas, lunar months, eclipse cycles, recurrent entries mentioning Jupiter, Mars, Venus. Then it started comparing those time sequences to a model of the ancient sky. Where were those planets, on those dates, above those ancient cities? The match was uncanny. Some tablets turned out to be detailed ephemerides, tables predicting where a planet would appear in the sky on a given night. The AI translated a series of terms and realized they described a zigzag function, a piecewise linear approximation of a curve, on clay, over 2,000 years ago. Scribes were using these zigzag functions to track the varying speed of Jupiter in the sky. They knew it didn't move at a constant rate against the stars. They could predict when it would slow down, stop and reverse course in retrograde motion. On certain tablets, the AI detected something even wilder, an area under the curve method, a geometric way of handling changing velocities that looked suspiciously like a rudimentary form of integral calculus. Long before calculus was supposedly invented, human experts had debated these interpretations. The AI didn't settle the argument. But by lining up the tablet's numerical schemes with actual planetary motion, it showed that whatever method the scribes were using, it worked. Their predictions were not symbolic guesses. They were accurate enough that we can check them night by ancient night. Then the machine ran into something darker and slower, references to the wandering of the rising places, to stars that no longer rose where the ancestors said they should, to constellations drifting ever so slightly along the horizon. Today we call this phenomenon the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble in Earth's axis that makes the background stars shift over a cycle of about 26,000 years. It was thought to have been first recognized explicitly by Greek astronomer Hipparchus in the 2nd century BCE. But some of the Mesopotamian tablets the AI translated seem to hint at an older recognition. Not a clean theoretical statement. Not the Earth wobbles like a top. Instead, layered observations, lists of where certain key stars rose and set, century after century, notes about the age of a constellation, how its position at the equinox had changed from the time of legendary kings. The AI picked up consistent offsets in the recorded positions that only make sense if the scribes were tracking a long, slow drift of the sky relative to their inherited records. Were they aware they were watching a planetary wobble, or were they simply meticulous archivists, faithfully copying down anomalies they couldn't explain? We don't know. What we do know is that when astronomers fed those ancient positions into modern software, the sky they described fit not the day the tablets were written, but older epochs, stretching back over centuries. The numbers tracked precession, quietly, patiently, long before the phenomenon had a name. This is where the mystery deepens. How did a culture without telescopes, without clocks as we know them, without electronics or digital storage, manage this level of precision? How did they build a mathematical language flexible enough to model complex motion with base 60 fractions and clay styluses? How did they maintain continuous sky records for so long that the slow dance of precession became visible against the background noise of generations living and dying? One explanation is the simplest: time and attention. Night after night, year after year, priests and scribes recording every rising and setting, every eclipse, every wandering of Mars. Over centuries the patterns would emerge for anyone patient enough to watch. But some researchers look at the tablets and see something else. They see a knowledge system that appears almost fully formed, sexagesimal arithmetic already mature, astronomical omen series already standardized, zigzag functions already in use. It's as if the scribes inherited a toolkit rather than inventing it from scratch. Did earlier, now-lost civilizations begin this work? Did catastrophic floods and invasions wipe out their cities while their methods survived as oral teachings, half-remembered, then pressed into clay by later hands? Or, as more speculative voices whisper, did some of this knowledge arrive from somewhere unexpected? Travellers, refugees, or something less easily categorized? Leaving behind only fragments in the form of numbers and stars? The AI can't answer that. It can only show us that the pattern is there. In tablet after tablet it finds astronomical observations tied to dates we can reconstruct. Lunar eclipses dated by regnal years that match modern calculations perfectly. Records of Venus cycles that align with its 8-year pattern. Predictions of Jupiter's return to specific constellations that our software can verify down to the year. These texts do not just describe the sky, they reach across time and let us test them, and they pass the test. So we're left with a strange picture, a civilization that walked in sandals, baked its records in clay, and wrote with reeds, yet could calculate planetary motions, approximate advanced mathematical concepts, and quietly notice the slow wobble of the world beneath their feet. Somewhere between the temple roof and the star-strewn darkness above, between the scratching of a stylus and the cold logic of an AI model, a question hangs unanswered. When ancient hands etched these numbers into wet clay, whose knowledge were they really recording? Theirs alone, or the faint surviving echo of something far older? For now, all we can do is keep reading, and let the tablets speak. By the time I reached the medical tablets, it had already traced kings, floods, and omens. But these clay fragments were different. They weren't about gods reshaping the world or rulers boasting of conquest. They were about bodies, about pain, about desperate attempts to keep fragile human life from slipping away. For decades, scholars had translated parts of these tablets by hand. Lists of ingredients, strange instructions, ritual phrases that sounded more like spells than prescriptions. But with thousands of fragments scattered across museums and private collections, the big picture was always out of reach. Each tablet was like a single page torn from a vast ancient medical encyclopedia. Then the AI started stitching the pages back together. Feeding on high-resolution scans of cracked, eroded clay, the model learned to recognize not just individual signs but patterns of thought, stock phrases, standard openings and closings, repeated combinations of symptoms and treatments. Where a human reader might see only a damaged line, the AI could compare it to hundreds of similar phrases from other tablets and predict what the missing pieces once said. Slowly, a system emerged. This wasn't random folk medicine. It was structured, organized, in some cases almost clinical. One reconstructed series of tablets, long thought to be a loose collection of remedies, turned out to follow a deliberate pattern: description of symptoms, likely causes, recommended treatment, expected outcome. The AI flagged repeated phrases like, "If after 3 days the fever does not leave him," followed by alternative procedures. To modern eyes, it begins to look suspiciously like a flowchart, an ancient decision tree for survival. And inside those decision trees were procedures that no one expected to find written so plainly thousands of years ago. Some tablets describe what can only be called surgical interventions, instructions for cutting open abscesses, directions on how to clean a wound with beer or wine before bandaging it with linen, lines detailing how to set a broken bone, how to immobilize a limb, how long the patient should rest before attempting to walk. One sequence describes probing a deep wound with a metal instrument, observing the color and thickness of the discharge, and deciding the patient's fate based on what emerges. To us, that reads like triage. In another tablet, the AI filled in a partially missing line that had stumped scholars for decades. The scribe listed tools in sequence: a bronze knife, a stylus-like instrument, bandages, oil. The missing term between knife and bandages suddenly resolved, a word related to stitching, to joining that which has been severed. If that interpretation holds, it may be one of the earliest written references to suturing a wound closed. Only a few lines later, the tone shifts. The practitioner is instructed to recite an incantation while working, calling on a god to hold fast the flesh as clay is bound in the kiln. To a modern reader, that's where the spell creeps in. But to the ancient healer, there was no dividing line. The physical act of stitching and the spoken formula were two halves of the same operation. The pharmaceutical recipes are just as striking. With the AI's help, scattered lists of plants, minerals, and animal products began to fall into recognizable patterns. Words once mistranslated or left as guesses suddenly clicked into place when cross-referenced with dozens of other tablets. A plant used for cooling the burning in the joints appears again in a recipe for relieving swelling in the hands and feet. When botanists matched the reconstructed name with likely candidates, one stood out: a plant modern medicine knows for its anti-inflammatory compounds. Another tablet recommends a mixture of willow bark, beer and honey for pain that seizes the head like a storm. Willow bark contains salicin, a chemical cousin of aspirin. Honey is a natural antimicrobial. Beer, with its low-grade alcohol content, may have helped dissolve certain compounds and lightly disinfect. To the scribe, this was not biochemistry. It was simply what worked, taught by masters, written in clay. but the alignment with modern pharmacology is eerie. Several recipes use garlic and onion pastes on infected wounds. Today, we know both plants have antimicrobial properties. Others combine resinous tree saps with oils to make salves that would have protected cuts from dirt and moisture. A preparation for trouble of the chest when breath comes hard and short involves steam inhalation of aromatic herbs, bronchodilation by trial and error. These weren't isolated strokes of luck. They were part of a tradition of observation and refinement, preserved line by line across generations of healers, written in a script that took years to master. But then the tablets remind you that this wasn't modern medicine, not quite. Nearly every practical remedy is entangled with ritual. A poultice is applied at dawn, facing east. A herbal wash must be prepared on a specific day of the lunar cycle. A surgery-like procedure is accompanied by offerings to a healing goddess, with strict instructions on what must be said, in what order, to ensure the god does not turn his face away. The AI's broad view made this blending impossible to ignore. It could group thousands of healing texts at once, revealing that almost no treatment stood alone without some kind of incantation or omen reading. A diagnosis might start with observation of symptoms. If a man's eyes are yellow and his belly swells and he's tired without walking, and then pivot to the sky. And if on that day the star of Marduk is dim, his disease is heavy. We recognize jaundice, likely liver disease. They recognize the same pattern in the body, but read its meaning in the heavens. Other descriptions are startlingly familiar. A man whose heart races like a frightened bird and his chest is tight and sleep flees from him. Another who cannot lift his right side, his speech is broken and his mouth droops. Today we might speak of anxiety, heart conditions, strokes. They spoke of demons, curses, or offended gods. Yet the symptoms are captured with almost clinical precision. The AI's pattern matching uncovered clusters of these repeating descriptions. It grouped tablets by symptom phrases long before anyone attached modern names. Short, gasping breaths, bluish lips, swollen legs, all echo heart failure. Intermittent episodes of trembling, loss of awareness, and collapse suggest seizures. In some texts, the writer even distinguishes between sudden death and lingering illness, as if tracking prognosis. They didn't have microscopes, or germ theory, or genetic testing, but they had eyes, memory, communal knowledge, and a burning need to keep people alive. Over centuries, that was enough to build something astonishingly close to a systematic medical tradition. And then, slowly, it fractured. Libraries burned, cities were abandoned, conquered, or buried. Scribes died without passing on their training. Clay tablets, durable but not immortal, shattered, eroded, or sank beneath river sediments. What did they know that we no longer do? We see only what survived. A recipe here, an observation there, a surgical hint in a damaged line. For every plant name the AI can reconstruct and match to a modern species, there may be dozens more lost to time, cures for infections, poisons, or chronic conditions that never made it across the centuries. Techniques for setting complex fractures, methods to manage pain without modern drugs, subtle diagnostic skills honed on thousands of patients, gone with the last healer who knew how to read the signs. The AI can stitch tablets together, but it can't revive an unbroken chain of teachers and apprentices that ran for hundreds of years. Still, what we can see is enough to ask uncomfortable questions. If a civilization 4,000 years ago could perform minor surgery, use effective plant-based pharmaceuticals, and track disease patterns closely enough that we can recognize them today, what else might have been within their reach? And if that knowledge could be forgotten once, could it happen again? The medical tablets don't answer. They only whisper, of hands pressing on swollen bellies under lamplight, of herbs crushed carefully in stone mortars, of prayers muttered over wounds as bronze tools glinted, of a world where medicine and magic were never separate categories, but one continuous attempt to push back the darkness, clay tablet by clay tablet, life by fragile life. By the time I had chewed through thousands of tablets about kings, floods, and gods, something unexpected started to surface from the clay. Not grand myths, not cosmic secrets, something smaller, quieter, more fragile. Voices. Not of priests and rulers, but of people who would have walked past them in the street and barely bowed. Merchants, students, lovers, annoyed parents, the kinds of people history almost never bothers to preserve. And yet, by some strange accident of technology and climate, their complaints, their anxieties, their jokes were all still there, locked in wedges of clay that hadn't felt human eyes in 4,000 years. And when I finally learned how to read them fluently, the first shock wasn't how different these people were. It was how utterly, disturbingly familiar. One of the first letters that made the research team stop and reread was from a mother to her son. The translation, refined and polished by the model after thousands of comparisons, went something like this. "You do not write to me. Why do you not write? Am I no longer your mother that you treat me so? Your brothers send word, but from you there is nothing." You can almost hear the exasperation behind those wedge-shaped signs. A woman in a dusty Mesopotamian city, maybe sitting by a small oil lamp, dictating to a scribe because her son had gone off to another town to work, or trade, or serve in some official's household, and he hadn't bothered to send a letter home. 4,000 years ago, someone was already getting the equivalent of the text. You can picture the son too, rolling his eyes, promising he'll write soon. Maybe he even did, scratching out a hasty reply on a cheap tablet, just enough to keep the family peace. We'll never know. His response tablet might be lost or still buried, but her disappointment survived. AI didn't just catch the literal words. It picked up formulaic patterns across thousands of letters. It learned which phrases marked genuine anger, which ones were just social performance, which ones meant, "I am offended," and which ones meant, "I miss you and I'm scared you've forgotten me." This wasn't the voice of an empire, it was the voice of a mother, and suddenly the distance between now and then didn't feel like 4,000 years. It felt like a weekend you forgot to call your parents. The deeper the AI went, the more of these small dramas emerged. Clay tablets turned out to be perfect for business disputes. You don't trust your partner, you make him sign his name in wedge marks that can't be erased without shattering the whole document. And so we get letters like, "You promised to deliver good quality copper. What you sent is not fit for use. I have weighed it. I have inspected it. It is inferior. You have cheated me." It reads like an angry email chasing a missing order. The AI picked up consistent patterns of insult and formality. There were standardized phrases that meant essentially, "I am very unhappy, but still open to resolving this," and harsher ones that conveyed, "If you don't fix this, I will ruin you." The model began to cluster these complaints, revealing entire webs of ancient commerce, agents, middlemen, rival merchants, all swapping threats and apologies, each one convinced they were in the right. It's easy to think of Mesopotamia as temples and ziggurats. The tablets show something else, a world of late payments, broken promises, and carefully worded outrage. And then there were the love letters. They aren't quite what modern ears might expect. Love, in these texts, is tangled with duty, property, and arrangement. But even through the dust of social obligation, sometimes something pure slips through. A line the AI flagged as unusually intense for its context. A phrase repeated more often than chance would suggest. "I am sick because you are far from me." Over and over, across different cities and centuries, variations of that sentence appear, sometimes dressed up in ritual language, sometimes bare and simple. The model recognized a pattern of metaphors, hearts described as heavy, livers as aching, eyes that do not sleep waiting for a lover's return. One letter, from a man to a woman, includes a detail that feels almost too intimate for stone and clay. When I pass the doorway where we spoke, I turn my face away, because it hurts me to see it empty. Some scholars had skimmed these tablets before and seen only standard stock formulas. AI, comparing tens of thousands at once, noticed that this combination of phrases is rare, emotionally charged, statistically out of place. That suggests something closer to genuine feeling than mere bureaucratic wording. History, for a brief moment, blushes. Then there's the family drama. Brothers arguing about inheritance. Sisters complaining that a dowry has not been fully paid. Uncles interfering again and again, as they seem to do in every time and place. One tablet, flagged by the Awajami as full of elevated, heated rhetoric, includes a line that translates to, "You have treated me not as a brother, but as a stranger at your gate." That's not just legal language. That's hurt. The pain of being cut out, not just from wealth, but from belonging. I help scholars see how the emotional temperature of certain letters spiked well above routine transactional texts. The algorithm doesn't feel anything, but it can measure depth, intensity, deviation from the norm. It can tell when someone long ago really cared about what they were saying. We like to imagine the ancients as stoic, resigned, bowed under priestly rule. The tablets say otherwise. They complained, they pleaded, they nagged, they loved, they gossiped. They were in many ways already us, and it wasn't just adults. Among the most quietly moving finds were the homework tablets. Cuneiform wasn't easy. Learning it meant hours of copying sign after sign, line after line, under the watchful eye of a strict teacher. Clay was cheap, so practice tablets were everywhere. Little rectangles, sometimes rounded at the edges, filled with wobbly strokes, lists of words, simple math problems, memorized proverbs. On one side, the teacher's perfect model. On the other, the student's clumsy imitation. AI, trained to spot minute variations in sign shape and stroke order, could distinguish between a master scribe's sure hand and a nervous beginner's tentative marks. It could even track the same student's progress across multiple tablets, noticing when their signs became more confident, more standardized, closer to the official pattern. It also found something else. Near the margins, squeezed between lines, or on the unused back of a tablet, there were extra marks, not part of the exercise, not part of any known text. Doodles, a crude drawing of a bird, a sketch of a human face, a strange little symbol repeated as if the student just liked the way it looked. In some cases, AI caught patterns that suggested the same hand drawing the same small personal mark over and over, like an ancient equivalent of scribbling your initials in a notebook. One practice tablet, barely noticed in earlier catalogues, contained an unusually high number of scraped-out lines. The student had pressed too hard, made mistakes, then tried to smooth the clay and rewrite. I flagged it as an outlier in error density. You can almost feel the frustration of a sleepy child, hand cramping, trying again and again to get the signs right while the teacher looms nearby. Struggling with homework, 4,000 years before modern students complained about math. This is where the story stops feeling like archaeology and starts feeling like time travel. Because once I organized these personal texts, not by date or city, but by emotional content, you could trace a strange continuity. Anxious parents, overworked merchants, young people in love, kids who would rather draw than study. The sorts of things you hear every day, reflected back from a time when the wheel was still a relatively new invention. It doesn't mean they were identical to us. Their world was soaked in rituals and gods, in omens and offerings. Their concepts of self, love, honor, and duty were shaped by forces we can only glimpse through broken shards of text. We should be careful not to erase those differences just because their voices sound familiar. But the tablets, once decoded, whisper something simple and unsettling into the dark. You've been here before. The fear of being forgotten, the sting of betrayal, the joy of a letter arriving at last, the nervous scratching of a student hoping to pass. These are not modern inventions. They are ancient habits of the human mind written in clay long before they were typed on screens. And as AI translates more of these everyday documents, the great empires and cosmic myths start to look less like distant legends and more like the backdrop to a single repeating story. People trying to live. The kings and gods still matter. The floods and omens still hold their mysteries. But behind every temple, behind every royal decree, there was always someone's mother waiting for news. Someone's lover staring at an empty doorway. Someone's child pressing a stylus into wet clay, hoping, perhaps, just to get through the lesson and go outside. Those are the voices AI has pulled from the dust, and once you've heard them, it becomes much harder to think of these tablets as relics. They feel instead like messages that were always meant to arrive, only delayed by 4,000 years, waiting for a reader who could finally listen fast enough and carefully enough to hear every ordinary, extraordinary word. By the time AI had worked through the myths, the omens, the medical recipes, and the everyday complaints, researchers thought they had a pretty good sense of what was on these tablets. Then the machine started flagging names that shouldn't have been there. At first, the system treated them like any other proper noun, a cluster of signs repeated often enough, with patterns that looked like titles attached. King of, followed by a city name. Year of the reign of, followed by a royal epithet. The algorithm dutifully logged them, cross-referenced them with known catalogues of Mesopotamian rulers, and came back with a strange result. Some of these kings did not exist. Not in any textbook. Not in the standard king lists. Not in a century of scholarship. One tablet, a dusty administrative record from a minor temple, mentioned the 5th year of Shahramatir, king of Adana. Another, a legal contract about a field dispute, was dated to the 11th year of Queen Belat Shunu, Lady of the Sea Gate. The AI flagged the pattern. Multiple independent tablets, from different archives, all referring to the same rulers as if everyone already knew who they were. Human researchers had skimmed past these names for decades, assuming scribal errors or local officials. AI didn't assume, it just counted. The more tablets it read, the clearer the pattern became. These weren't typos. They were rulers of real political entities we had never truly recognized. It turned out our picture of the ancient Near East, those neat timelines with straight arrows and tidy dynasties, was full of blank spaces we hadn't even known were there. Because history, as we teach it, tends to follow the big empires. Akkad, Ur, Babylon, Assyria. But the clay told a different story. A crowded map of smaller kingdoms, city-states, breakaway dynasties that rose and fell between the cracks of the great powers. AI began grouping tablets by their formulas, their phrase choices, the way dates were recorded. Out of that statistical fog, entire shadow dynasties emerged. Short-lived royal lines ruling for 20, 30, 50 years, never mentioned in the official chronicles of the great empires, but very real to the farmers paying taxes and the merchants swearing oaths in their names. One cluster of texts referred repeatedly to the house of Lugal-Enlil in a city called Kirsu-Amar. The AI collated temple inventories, court cases, and shipments of barley, building a timeline of at least 4 successive Lugal-Enlil kings spread over roughly a century. No ancient king list mentions them. They were ghosts in the record, brought back by statistics and silicon, And then there were the cities. Cuneiform scribes were obsessed with locations. Deliveries were always from somewhere and to somewhere. Envoys came and went. Border disputes named rivers, hills, canals. AI, trained to treat these toponyms as data points, began producing maps. The first surprise was scale. There were dozens of city names that didn't match any known archaeological site. Not just one or two ambiguous villages, but entire urban centres described with their walls, gates, temples, and markets. Tablets spoke casually of places like Nagakalam, where the three rivers meet, or Urkalashadu, the city against the mountain. Contracts described shipping routes from the docks of Nemed Enki to the quay of Turu Magal, as if these ports were ordinary, famous, impossible to misunderstand. Today we have no idea where they were. Some of these cities may lie under modern towns. Some may have been eroded away by rivers changing course. Others might still be buried deep under desert sands, their mud brick walls slowly turning back into dust. But in the tablets, they are alive. They collect taxes. They send diplomats. They rebel, are punished, and return to obedience. They host festivals that attract pilgrims from hundreds of kilometers away. AI, reading tablet after tablet, traced trade routes that connected these lost cities to the ones we know. A shipment of lapis lazuli starts in a mountain city we haven't found, passes through 3 intermediate towns and ends up in a royal workshop in Ur. Tin ingots move the opposite way. Cedar wood appears, stamped with seals from a coastal city that has never been excavated. Somewhere along the line, a scribe complains that the caravan was late because of bandits near a town whose name doesn't appear on any modern map. The more the system read, the more intricate the web became. Lines of trade and communication stretching from the Levantine coast to the Zagros Mountains, from the Persian Gulf up into Anatolia. Not vague guesses, but specific routes, toll stations, transit times. An ancient logistics network detailed in clay. We had known trade existed, but the tablets taken together suggested something closer to early globalization. Cloth from one region paid as wages in another. Grain from a distant floodplain used to feed workers digging a canal hundreds of miles away. A drought in one kingdom triggering price spikes in a distant city by way of disrupted caravans and panicked merchants. And then, I stumbled into something stranger. Letters. Most of the famous diplomatic archives, like those of Vamana, were already well studied, but scattered among more mundane documents in other collections were isolated. Fragmentary letters that no one had ever fully connected. AI translation and pattern matching tied them together. It recognized the formal opening lines of royal correspondence. Long sequences of honorifics, stock blessings, invocations of gods and ancestors. It saw that certain unusual turns of phrase appeared in letters from different sites, suggesting a single scribal school or cultural sphere. Slowly, what had seemed like random, isolated messages resolved into threads of conversation between courts we didn't even know existed. One letter, for example, preserved in a private archive far from any royal centre, begins, "Thus says Tahu Nasi, king of the upper cities, to Sharumatir, king of Karadana, my brother. May Shamash and Adad keep you in health." There was Tarhu Nasi again, that same uncertain name, I had seen attached to tribute lists and war declarations. Here he was, writing as an equal to another king. The clay went on to discuss a marriage alliance, delayed shipments of horses, and the status of a disputed border fortress. Another group of letters referenced a coastal kingdom called the Land of White Stones. Its ruler sent envoys with gifts of shell, purple-dyed fabric, and fish of the deep sea in exchange for copper and grain. No major chronicle mentioned such a kingdom. Its people remain archaeologically invisible, yet their scribes wrote with ease, using the same diplomatic protocols as the rulers of larger empires. Taken one by one, these letters are curiosities. Taken in bulk, as the AI can, they are evidence of a dense diplomatic world we have barely glimpsed. Coalitions, rivalries, marriage alliances and betrayals, all playing out between kingdoms that have left little or no physical trace, except for the words their scribes pressed into clay. Sometimes, what the tablets describe doesn't just add detail, it contradicts what we thought we knew. AI identified references to battles that don't fit into our established timelines. Chronicles long assumed to be exaggerated propaganda may turn out to be more accurate than skeptical modern historians believed. In other cases, events we treated as singular catastrophes, like the fall of a city or the collapse of a dynasty, appear in the tablets as part of a long cycle of revolt and reconquest, loss and restoration. One sequence of documents, for instance, suggests that a supposedly sudden imperial collapse unfolded over decades of simmering revolt, economic stress, and shifting trade patterns. We see the same city switching loyalty back and forth between rival kings as barley prices climb and caravan routes shift. In the grand narratives, it fell once. In the clay, it failed repeatedly and somehow kept standing. Until, finally, it didn't. In other cases, AI translations showed that scribes were not always truthful, even in lists we treated as pure data. Some kings inflated their years of reign, others retroactively claimed victories that the administrative tablets quietly record as defeats. The clay preserves both the story people wanted to tell about themselves and the messy reality they lived through. What emerges from all of this is not a neat, corrected version of history, but something more unsettling and more beautiful. A realization of how little we truly know. For every lost city named, there are probably others still silent. For every forgotten king, I pulls out of obscurity. There may be dozens whose names are erased, whose tablets turned to mud long ago. For every trade route we can reconstruct, countless others vanished with the caravans that walked them. We like to think of the ancient world as mapped, catalogued, essentially understood. A handful of famous civilizations in a small number of well-studied valleys. But as AI listens more deeply to the clay, a different picture emerges. A world crowded with polities, dialects, customs, rivalries. A world of kings whose names no one has spoken for 4,000 years, of cities whose walls once cast long shadows on riverbanks that have since changed their course, and this might only be the beginning. The tablets AI has translated so far are a fraction of what survives. The tablets we have excavated are a fraction of what was written. The sites we've found are a fraction of what still lies buried. The humbling truth is that history, as we currently tell it, may be little more than the visible tip of an immense submerged continent of human experience. AI isn't rewriting that history by itself. It's simply shining a colder, more patient light into the cracks, revealing that the story is wider, stranger, and far less complete than we imagined. The lost cities are still out there, under fields and roads and deserts. The forgotten kings are still waiting in untranscribed tablets stacked in museum storerooms. And with every new line of cuneiform that AI decodes, the past shifts a little under our feet, reminding us that the ancient world is not a closed book, but a library we've only just begun to read. By the time scribes began pressing wet reeds into clay to record contracts and royal decrees, they were already doing something even more ambitious. They were trying to write the future. Hidden among the economic accounts and royal inscriptions, the AI started to notice a pattern. Hundreds, then thousands of tablets using the same phrases. If this sign appears, then that will happen. Over and over again. So many that, once digitized, they formed one of the largest categories of cuneiform writing we possess, omen texts. To a modern reader they can look almost obsessive. Every possible event, every strange occurrence, every flicker in the sky or birth defect in the stable turned into a data point in a vast system of prediction. Nothing was random. Everything meant something. The AI didn't just translate the words, it started clustering them, matching phrase to phrase, sign to sign. It saw that what looked like superstition was actually highly structured, a logic system, if then statements stretching across generations. If the moon is eclipsed and its shadow lies in the west, the king's enemies will fall. If a child is born with 6 fingers, famine will visit the land. If Venus disappears from the sky for 3 days, a foreign army will invade. To the people who wrote these lines, the universe was not silent. It was constantly sending messages. The task of the scholar-priest was to learn the code. The most prestigious of these codes was celestial, not dreams, not animal entrails, but the sky itself. The stars and planets were divine writings spread across a dark tablet. Ancient astronomer priests stood on ziggurats night after night, year after year, tracking the paths of Jupiter, Mars, Venus. They noted when a planet slowed, when it reversed course, when it vanished in the glare of the sun. They built tables of appearances and disappearances brick by brick, observation by observation, until they could say not just what had happened, but what would happen. From our perspective, it looks like a strange fusion, real astronomy welded to a worldview of gods and omens. The tablets list eclipses with astonishing precision, then jump without hesitation to interpretation. If an eclipse occurs on the 14th day, plague will depart the land. If an eclipse begins in the east and ends in the south, the king will face revolt. The AI, trained on thousands of languages and logical structures, flagged something curious. The predictive element wasn't entirely fantasy. The priestly astronomers had noticed cycles. They knew roughly when eclipses would return. They had linked certain sky configurations to particular times of year when floods, harvests, or storms were more likely. They didn't understand orbital mechanics, but they understood patterns. Some of the predictions in the Omen series turned out, under modern analysis, to be retroactive matches, events remembered, omens fitted to them later, but not all of them. A few tablets describe a coming eclipse with such detail so far in advance that modern astronomers can check them against known celestial cycles. The timing lines up. The path of totality lines up. The Omen priests had, in effect, built a primitive predictive model of the heavens. Here's where things become unsettling. On more than one tablet, the AI found sequences where a scribe calmly lists a sky sign, gives its meaning, and then notes that the meaning came true in a specific year. A comet appears in the constellation of the Lion. The text states that a foreign power will burn cities in the west. A later note, written in the same hand but after the fact, records a campaign, the burning of particular towns, the collapse of a regional dynasty. Is this confirmation bias frozen in clay? Or was a long memory, combined with careful tracking of repeat events, genuinely allowing them to anticipate political turmoil linked to environmental and cosmic cycles? Good harvest decades, bad harvest decades, waves of migration triggered by changing rainfall? We don't know. But the pattern was powerful enough that kings were willing to stake their lives on it. In the Royal Archives, prophecy isn't just a curiosity, it's a tool of governance. Letters survive where scholars warn the king not to travel on a certain day because Saturn is badly placed. Other notes advise postponing a military campaign because an eclipse has just occurred on the wrong date in the wrong part of the sky. Sometimes the scribe suggests a remedy. If a bad omen appears for the king, they might enthrone a substitute king, a condemned man dressed in royal clothing, treated like a monarch for a few days, then ritually killed to divert the foretold disaster. The real king waits in the palace shadows, anonymous, while destiny spends itself on the decoy. War, too, was wrapped in prophecy. Before marching, generals demanded liver readings from sacrificed sheep. The shape, colour and marks on the liver were compared against carved models and written omen lists. If the answers were wrong, the campaign might be delayed or cancelled entirely. Victory and defeat in this system were not just about soldiers and supplies, but about whether the universe was saying yes or no. The AI's greatest surprise, though, didn't come from battle omens or everyday predictions. It came from a subset of tablets that deal not with next week or next year, but with the end. These are not as numerous, but they stand out. They describe worlds that end not once, but in cycles. Sumerian and Babylonian scholars speak of past destructions, floods that erased kingship, fires that burned cities and fields, plagues that emptied whole regions. They then speak of future repetitions. If mankind sins against the gods, the rivers will rise again, the fields will salt, the cities will be scattered. When the stars change their paths and do not return, the reigns of kings will be numbered. Some of these texts echo the flood myths already familiar from epics like Gilgamesh, but others are cooler, almost mechanical. They talk about the order of heaven and earth becoming unbalanced, about the length of days changing, about winds shifting direction for many years, about rulers who ignore warnings, build lavishly, consume recklessly, and then watch their lands fail. To ancient readers, these were moral stories. The gods punish arrogance, reward humility, but when researchers fed the Omen and end-time text into climate and catastrophe databases, a few eerie parallels emerged. Periods of social collapse in Mesopotamia often line up with evidence of extended droughts, dust storms, changes in river courses. The tablets remember these as divine anger. We recognize them as environmental disasters. The Omen texts, with their cyclical view of history, essentially say, this has happened before, it will happen again. That's where the parallels to our own age start to bother people. Some researchers reading the AI's reconstructions see more than myth. They see early pattern recognition. Farmers watching harvests fail after a string of hot, dry years. Fishermen noting changes in river flow. Priests tracking odd shifts in the rising points of certain stars because dust and moisture altered visibility. All of it wrapped in the language of gods and omens, because that was the only language they had. They warn of leaders who ignore these signs, of regimes that double down on old habits while the environment quietly changes around them, of societies that expand until they hit some invisible limit, then contract suddenly, violently, leaving only broken bricks and a few scratched lines in clay. We can't claim that ancient scribes predicted modern climate change or global war or technological runaway. That would be dishonest. But the AI's work forces a quieter, more uncomfortable thought. For at least 4,000 years, humans have been trying to read the future. They watched the sky, the rivers, the winds. They built massive libraries of patterns, correlations, and warnings. They encoded them in clay, believing that if the next generation could just read the signs, maybe the worst outcomes could be avoided. Now another kind of mind, silicon instead of clay, is reading those same warnings. It recognizes cycles. It highlights lines about failing harvests, about rising waters, about rulers who refuse to listen. It flags them because, to its pattern-hungry algorithms, they look familiar. Maybe the ancients weren't seeing literal messages from the gods. Maybe what they were glimpsing, dimly, through liver readings and star charts, was something more universal. The way complex systems, climate, politics, economies, build pressure silently, then suddenly change. To them the future was written in the sky. To us, it's plotted in data. But the feeling is the same. The sense that we're living in a story whose next chapter has been foreshadowed, if only we could read the signs clearly enough. And somewhere, in a tablet cracked and half erased, a long-dead scribe has already written his verdict on civilizations that ignore the omens and keep going as if nothing can ever truly end. For everything the tablets have already revealed, there's a quieter, more unsettling truth that lingers in the background. We've barely started. Right now, in museum basements, university archives and half-forgotten storerooms scattered across the world, there are not dozens, not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of clay tablets that no human has ever truly read. Some have only been given a quick catalogue number and a rough label. Many haven't even been unwrapped from the old newspaper or packing straw they were shipped in a century ago. Some estimates suggest that as much as 80 to 90% of the known cuneiform corpus is either untranslated, only partially read, or never seriously studied. Think about that. For every tablet that has given us a king list, a star map, a medical recipe, or a flood story, there might be 10 more sitting in the dark, their wedge-shaped marks quietly holding on to secrets from 4,000 years ago. Contracts for land and grain, letters between kings, ritual instructions that no one alive understands, astronomical observations spanning centuries, philosophical reflections, jokes, arguments, fears, a library of human thought locked in clay. An eye has cracked open a door into that silent archive, but beyond that door the hallways still stretch on almost without end. The researchers working on these systems know this better than anyone. They will tell you, almost with a sense of awe, that what we've seen so far might be nothing more than the surface layer, a skim of the most accessible, the best preserved, the easiest to classify. Training data. Underneath that they suspect are texts of a very different kind, longer, stranger, harder to categorize. Tablets that don't fit cleanly into the boxes we've already built, not just legal, astronomical, ritual, or personal, but hybrids. A star catalogue that slips suddenly into theology, a legal document that conceals a political coup, a prophecy that reads more like a scientific report of an event we still don't understand. Some AI models are already hinting at these edges. When they're fed large, messy collections of tablet images, they occasionally cluster together texts that human scholars never thought belonged in the same category. A ritual text grouped with a trade contract, a medical tablet linked with an omen series. At first glance, it looks like a mistake. Then someone reads more closely and realizes there's a repeated phrase, or a shared symbol, or a similar pattern of numbers. Tiny threads. Invisible until a machine, trained to notice patterns we overlook, quietly tugs on them. This is what the researchers are starting to suspect, that hidden among the hundreds of thousands of still silent tablets are the connective tissues of ancient thought, the bridges between domains, the missing links that might show us how Mesopotamian people really organized their knowledge, not as neat boxes but as networks. There may be whole genres we barely know exist. Political philosophy disguised as court correspondence, proto-scientific speculation disguised as myth, experiments in mathematics no one recognized because they were dropped into a larger ritual text like a side note. But there is another pressure building, a quieter, more ruthless one. Time. Clay lasts a long time, longer than wood, longer than leather, longer than papyrus, but it does not last forever. Many tablets were never properly fired. They were sun-dried, or only partially baked in accidental fires. Their surfaces flake. The impressions blur. Salts creep in from old burial soils and slowly push the clay apart from the inside. Every year, some percentage of those wedge-shaped marks become a little less sharp, a little more fragile, a little closer to being noise instead of text. In some storerooms the damage is obvious. Surfaces peeling, corners crumbling, tablets collapsing into powder if handled too roughly. In others, The danger is invisible: microcracks, slow warping, chemical reactions in the clay. By the time a human eye sees it, parts of the text may already be gone. This is why some archaeologists and digital humanists talk about a race against time. Not a dramatic chase across deserts, but a quiet, methodical sprint in labs and archives. Photograph everything, scan everything, before the edges fade, before the signs are lost. Capture as much of the surface as possible, so that, even if the clay continues to crumble, the information doesn't. AI is becoming the partner in that race. New projects are underway that sound almost impossible until you remember what's already been done. Systems that can take low-quality, partially damaged photographs from decades ago and reconstruct missing wedges. Models that learn to fill in broken sections by comparing them to thousands of similar phrases, suggesting what was most likely written there. Algorithms that can process entire museum collections overnight, sorting tablets into categories that used to require years of labour. Some teams are working on ways to read tablets that are too fragile to touch at all, imaging them with different wavelengths of light, generating 3D models where even the faintest depressions, invisible to the naked eye, become measurable data. Then handing those models to AI systems that can tease out patterns, marks, even traces of erased or overwritten text. It's not perfect, it never will be, but in many cases it's the difference between nothing and enough to read. As these projects expand, so does the sense that something larger might be waiting. We've already seen AI uncover unexpected details, a forgotten eclipse record here, a unique ritual formula there, a letter that rewires our understanding of a familiar king. Small corrections, subtle shifts. But when you multiply that by hundreds of thousands of unstudied texts, a different possibility emerges. That somewhere in that mass of clay is a tablet, or a cluster of tablets, that does not just tweak our timelines, but fundamentally rewrites them. A record of a disaster we didn't know happened. A description of a people we thought were myth, evidence of mathematical methods centuries ahead of what we assumed, a narrative of origins that doesn't match the stories we've grown used to. Paradigm-shifting discoveries don't always announce themselves with gold and jewels. Sometimes they look like a dull brown rectangle covered in tiny scratches, the kind a museum catalogue once labelled simply administrative text, provenance unknown. We don't know what's lurking in those shelves, but for the first time we have a tool that can actually look at everything. Not a few dozen texts selected by chance or beauty, but entire collections, systematically, relentlessly. That's why many researchers quietly say that this is not the end of the story of ancient Mesopotamia. It's the beginning. For over a century, our picture of the ancient Near East has been shaped by a tiny fraction of the available evidence. We built grand theories from scattered fragments. We filled in gaps with guesses, some careful, some wild. We argued about what the Anunnaki meant, about how advanced their astronomy really was, about whether their flood stories echoed real events or pure myth. Now, as AI starts to whisper translations of tablets that no one ever thought to prioritize, we're facing the possibility that the foundation of those theories may need to be rebuilt. Not crushed, not discarded, just expanded, refined, complicated. In a way, we're returning to the same position as those bottleneck survivors hundreds of thousands of years ago. We stand in front of a new landscape of information, still harsh and confusing, still full of gaps. We have a new tool, silicon instead of stone, but the challenge is the same. Learn fast, share knowledge, adapt our stories as new data arrives. The sleepers in the storerooms, the clay tablets stacked in quiet rows wrapped in yellowing paper, sealed in boxes no one has opened in decades. They are not just artifacts. They are voices, paused mid-sentence, waiting for someone or something to finish listening. A eye has begun that listening, but what it ultimately hears, What those tablets will say when enough of them finally speak together may change not just how we see one ancient civilization, but how we understand the entire arc of human history. For a moment, let all of this settle. Clay tablets buried for 4,000 years. A script almost no one alive could read. Stories half remembered in myth, dismissed as legend. Scattered fragments in museum drawers. And then, silently, in the background of the modern world, circuits flicker to life. An artificial mind learns the shapes of those ancient wedges, the patterns of a language that died before any modern nation existed. And slowly, patiently, the past begins to speak again. What those tablets say is not just trivia. It's not just lists of barley rations and temple inventories, though there are plenty of those. It's a mirror, and the reflection staring back at us is unsettlingly familiar. We thought we knew the outline of human history, a slow rise from simple villages to cities, from superstition to science, from chaos to order. But the texts is decoding hint at something more complicated. Floods that sound older than the myths we thought were the originals. Star charts and mathematical rules more advanced than we expected for their time. Healing recipes balance between medicine and magic, as if their authors stood with one foot in two different worlds. They suggest that people 4,000 years ago were not primitive minds stumbling in the dark. They were careful observers of the sky, skilled record keepers of catastrophe, experimenters with plants, minerals, and the human body. They wrestled with questions about gods and fate, and the meaning of omens in ways that feel uncomfortably close to how we wrestle with algorithms, climate models, and probabilities today. And the strangers in these stories, the Anunnaki, the gods who teach, who descend, who demand, they force us to admit how much we still don't understand. Were they divine beings? Powerful rulers later turned into deities? Memories of an older, lost culture? Or something else entirely? The tablets do not give a single clear answer. They give glimpses, patterns, clues, enough to know the picture we have of the ancient world is incomplete, but not enough to finish the puzzle. That's the real revelation of what AI has done here. Not that it solves the mystery, but that it widens it. It shows us that history is not a finished story carved in stone. It's a living investigation. Every new tablet scanned, every broken line reconstructed, every forgotten name restored can shift our understanding by a fraction of a degree. Over time, those tiny shifts can redirect the entire arc of the story we tell about ourselves. Tonight you've walked through 4,000 years of whispers, from royal decrees to private letters, from cosmic omens to quiet domestic worries, from maps of the skies to maps of imaginary realms. All of it hidden in clay, waiting for a technology no scribe could have imagined. And now, as you lie there, somewhere in the world, you are part of that story too. If you'd like to keep travelling through these shadowed corridors of history with me, you can gently tap like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from, which city, which coast, which corner of the night. Across oceans and time zones, your voice becomes another tiny inscription, another data point in the long record of humans listening to stories in the dark. Because that's another thread that never seems to change. Long before writing, your ancestors gathered around fire sharing tales of gods and kings, floods and omens. Now you gather around a screen while a digital voice reads out the secrets of ancient clay. What connects those moments is simple. A mind drifting at the edge of sleep wondering what came before. As you close your eyes, imagine those tablets still resting in the earth, countless more not yet found, their symbols untouched, their stories unread. Somewhere, under sand and stone, another name waits to be spoken for the first time in 4,000 years. Another piece of the puzzle waits to bend the story again. History is not finished. It is still being written, still being uncovered, still changing shape every time we dare to look a little closer. Let that thought stay with you as you drift off. That beneath the familiar surface of the world there are still mysteries, still lost cities, still forgotten kings, still gods, or something like them, waiting in the gaps of our knowledge. And somewhere, quietly, an AI continues to read.